You, as representatives of the American people, have before you the glorious opportunity of carrying on the pioneer work of your ancestors beyond the frontiers of physical and geographical limitations. Their brawn and thews braved undauntedly almost unbelievable hardships to open up a new continent. The modern world lauds them for their vigor and intensity of purpose and for their accomplishment. You have today before you the immeasurably greater opportunity to implement these same ideals and to help bring about the liberation of man's spirit in every part of the world. In order to accomplish this purpose, we of the United Nations must now so prosecute the war that victory will be ours decisively and with all good speed. Sun Tzu, the well-known Chinese strategist, said, "In order to win, know thyself and thy enemy." We have also the saying, "It takes little effort to watch the other fellow carry the load." In spite of these teachings from a wise old past, which are shared by every nation, there has been a tendency to belittle the strength of our opponents. When Japan thrust total war on China in 1937, military experts of every nation did not give China even a ghost of a chance. But when Japan failed to bring China cringing to her knees, as she vaunted, the world took solace in this phenomenon by declaring that they had overestimated Japan's military might. Nevertheless, when the greedy flames of war inexorably spread in the Pacific following the perfidious attack on Pearl Harbor, Malaya, and lands in and around the China Sea, and one after another of these places fell, the pendulum swung to the other extreme. Doubts and fears lifted their ugly heads, and the world began to think that the Japanese were Nietzschean Superman, superior in intellect and physical prowess, a belief which the Gobineaus and the Houston Chamberlains and their ex-pupils, the Nazi racists, had propounded about the Nordics. Again, now the prevailing opinion seems to consider the defeat of the Japanese as of relative unimportance, and that Hitler is our first concern. This is not borne out by actual facts, nor is it to the interests of the United Nations as a whole to allow Japan to continue not only as a vital potential threat, but as a waiting sword of Damocles, ready.
World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as the leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's Doug Edwards with a summary of headline news as received in New York.
Here are the latest developments. The Navy has announced the loss of America's largest submarine. Red Army troops have widened their gains in the Dnieper Basin and at other points on the Eastern Front. Allied bombers have blasted Japanese airdromes and harbor installations in the Solomons and New Britain. The British Eighth Army is pushing on toward the Marit Line, but there have been new Axis gains in central Tunisia. Now for news direct from French North Africa, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Algiers. Charles Collingwood reporting.
This is Charles Collingwood in North Africa. The Germans have already dented our new Tunisian line. After we beat off an attack on the Kasserine Pass day before yesterday, the Germans attacked again yesterday, and this time they took the pass. Today's communique speaks of local enemy gains in this area, but we know they have the past. Heavy fighting is still going on, and British armored forces have moved down to reinforce the American units in the Kasserine area. It is just possible that the Germans may not be able to hold on to their new gains. We can't tell until we know the results of today's fighting. At the moment, all we know is that the Germans have the Kasserine Pass. Yesterday, General Bergeret, the number 2 man in the French African government, told correspondents out here some facts on the number of political prisoners still in African camps. I think many people were surprised to learn that there are still 734 French communists in concentration camps here. Some of these are local communists, but most of them were arrested 3.5 years ago in France when Russia was in uneasy alliance with Germany. They were brought over here in 1940 after the fall of France. By far the most notable of these French communists were 27 deputies, representatives properly and popularly elected to the French Chamber of Deputies, which is equivalent to our Congress. When those 27 were arrested, it was a sensation which shook all France. In the years that have passed, France and the world forgot about the 27 until we arrived in North Africa and found them still in jail outside of Algiers. A couple of weeks ago, the communist deputies were released, and last week I had a talk with some of their number. They were a little gray, a little blank from their years in prison. They'd been out a week, but they said they still got sick when they ate a heavy meal. They were a little bewildered at the new shape of things that had come about while they had been away, and they were searching desperately for some part to play in this new world. Mido, a gray-headed old Union leader, a little seedy from prison life, kept saying, there must be some way we can help the Allies. All we want to do is beat Germany. And Rocher, who is a quiet, thoughtful man, said, after all, we represent thousands of people in France. They elected us. They still believe in us. They are worried and confused by what's happening. Why can't we go to the radio and talk to them and tell them that they must continue to believe in the Allies, that only one thing counts, and that is that Germany must be beaten? The communist deputy sat in my hotel room talking like that for a long time. It was a pathetic interview. After 3.5 years, they'd come out of prison into a world that seemed full of hope, but there was nothing for them to do in that world. Or if there was, no one would let them do it. This is Charles Collingwood, returning you to New York.
More news in just a moment. But first, here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
From all battlefronts, land, sea, and air, from all quarters of the globe, comes news of American fighting men in action. And with every dispatch, Admiral workers receive fresh inspiration. Admiral workers are producing radios for American fighting men. Radios which are now on the fighting fronts, welding forces together, helping units and men work as a team. Perhaps, at this instant, a Navy flyer with an Admiral-built radio in his plane is on patrol duty. He spots a Nazi submarine. He radios a report to his base. A destroyer, summoned by radio, speeds out to sea. It locates the submarine's exact position by means of a radio device. And when the submarine is sunk, the destroyer reports to its commander by radio. Admiral is building all types of radios used in such action as this, the best radios in the world, for neither our Army or Navy will accept anything less than the best. Both the Army and Navy know only too well this coordinated action of planes, ships, men, and weapons depends upon radio, and both insist upon getting the best radio equipment. Admiral will build such equipment to the limit of its capacity and keep on doing so until this war is won. After that, Admiral radios will again be made for the American home, each one worthy of carrying on the tradition that an Admiral is America's smart set. Now, here once again is Doug Edwards.
Across the Atlantic, the British people are watching developments in India, where Mohandas Gandhi's condition grows worse. For a report on this news and other developments, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS London, John Daly reporting.
There are no new reports in London on Gandhi's fast, other than that his condition is growing more serious. Britain's weekend celebration of the 25th birthday of the Russian Red Army reached its high point this afternoon when British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden addressed an enthusiastic audience packed into Albert Hall. Eden paid high tribute to the gallant Russian armies and said that never in its long history had the German army suffered a disaster like that at Stalingrad. At the beginning of his speech, he had a surprise, a message to the British people from Stalin. Stalin, on behalf of the armed forces of the Soviet Union, thanked the citizens of Great Britain for the celebration. Its effect, he said, would be to strengthen confidence in Russia that the moment is near when the combined armies of Britain and Russia, by joint operations, will smash the common enemy. The allusion to joint operations leaves little doubt that Stalin does not consider the North African diversion enough, but he is not alone in that. The Casablanca conferences between Roosevelt and Churchill brought a promise that Europe would be invaded soon. And here in England, the people are not worried about the present reverses in Tunisia because they have any doubts as to the final outcome there, but because they're afraid the upsetting of the timetable in Tunisia will hold back the planned invasion of the European continent. Although we may have to wait for a land offensive against Europe, the Allied air offensive against Europe is well on its way right now. I have just returned from a bomber station of the United States Army 8th Air Force, a station from which flying fortresses fly across the English Channel to bomb Nazi sub-bases and industrial centers by daylight. It's a dirty, nasty job, and we're losing planes and men. I talked to an American squadron leader at that bombing station who had lost one of his planes in a raid over Europe, and he had something he wanted me to tell you. He received a brave, pathetic letter from the mother of one of the boys on a fortress that was lost. She gave her boy for the cause of freedom because it was necessary. But, she said, I have been told that the British have taken all our good planes and given us old, inferior ships to use. Was my boy in one of those old ships? That squadron leader told me to tell you to rack that up as another piece of dirty Nazi propaganda. He told me to tell you that they are flying American planes, the best that you at home build. But he said they needed more of them, and it was up to you to see that they got them. This is John Daly in London. I return you now to CBS, New York.
The Russians celebrated the 21st anniversary of the Red Army today by rolling on unhalted toward the Dnieper River. Moscow's latest bulletin places Russian forces in the river basin within 34 miles of Dnipropetrovsk and Poltava. And all along the 500-mile front from Oryol to Krasnodar, the Red Armies report victories which have left almost 2,000 dead Germans on the battlefields. Yesterday's capture of the important rail junctions of Pavlograd and Krasnograd disrupts all direct German communications between Kharkov and the Donetsk Basin regions to the south. In the Donetsk area, the Russians continue to mop up remaining German troops. The Red Army reports the capture of a number of villages west of Rostov and southwest of Voroshilovgrad, and the Russians claim they repelled Nazi counterattacks in the Krasnoarmeysk region. Soviet forces advancing from Krasnograd have stormed more towns, killing 400 Germans and capturing supplies. To the north, on the Oryol front, midway between Moscow and Kharkov, the Russians report gains despite strong enemy resistance. At one point, German automatic riflemen seized a town, but Red troops surrounded the enemy and wiped out every man. On the fighting in the Caucasus, the Russians report the capture of a district center 17 miles west of Krasnodar. The German version of the fighting on the Eastern Front is vague as usual. The Nazis say they repelled attacks in the area of Rezhev, the strong German base 130 miles northwest of Moscow. And the enemy communique said Russian pressure slackened at several points between Oryol and the Azov Sea because of a break in the weather and heavy losses. Meantime, Moscow and other Russian cities rang with speeches and jubilation in celebration of the Red Army's anniversary. Patriotic slogans are displayed everywhere. A typical one says, "Hail to the victory of the Anglo-Soviet-American alliance over the base enemies of humanity, the German fascist enslavers." Back in this country, most of us have given little attention to our Coast Guard, despite its day and night alert. For an on-the-spot account of these activities, Admiral Radio takes you now to a Coast Guard patrol boat in Lower New York Bay. Bill Slocum, Jr. reporting.
Old New York's grimy streets and depressing masses of skyscraper loom only a few short miles from me now, and they're the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in all this world. Say what you want about them, they do not bounce, and this overgrown canoe the Coast Guard calls a patrol boat combines the worst features of an airplane and a submarine. Actually, the little beast moves with considerable speed, and when it does, there isn't too much unpleasantness. But it is on anchorage patrol in the busiest harbor in the world, and that means every so often it sidles up to a freighter and wallows around while expert Coast Guardsmen make quite sure the freighter is where it belongs and is doing nothing it shouldn't do. Whether there are hundreds of boats in the harbor or whether there is a dozen is a little matter the censors feel should be a secret between them, myself, and the thousands who travel in ferries. But as anybody who lives in a harbor town can tell you, as dusk falls, sometimes you'll see the harbor filled. When dawn comes, it is practically empty. And another convoy of death and destruction for the Axis and food and warmth for the Allies is on its way. It's the job of the Coast Guard Harbor Patrol to see to it that these freighters, many of them Liberty ships, take on their precious cargo without interference as they clear this harbor in as much secrecy as possible. These Coast Guardsmen are a combination seagoing policemen and firemen. They ferret all over the waterfront on foot, in boats, in jeeps, and in airplanes. And if they see anything amiss, they are all trained to nip it in the bud and keep damage to a minimum. The boat I'm on is on anchorage patrol. There are other Coast Guard units who see that only accredited citizens are given access to the waterfront. Others keep their eyes open for fire hazards. And they're all better than expert hands at mob and riot control. We're going to hear this crew in action shortly, I'm sure, because we're bearing down now on a big freighter, swinging at anchor and loaded to the gunwales with, shall we say, general...